Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Adoptions from the Heart TV. I'm your host, Amanda Aliberti. Adoptions from the Heart has primarily always done infant adoptions, and we have seen an increase over the last couple years of women and men reaching out, considering placing an older child. So we are connecting today with Chris and Jackie out of our New Jersey office. So Chris, can you kind of jump into what you have seen in terms of intake process of folks who are inquiring about placing a child other than a newborn?
Yeah, as you said, I think we've seen an increase in birth parents reaching out to us who are at least interested in having a conversation about considering adoption for their child who's not an infant, who's not a newborn. And I think there's a number of different factors to that. Certainly, sometimes it's single parents who are struggling to raise the child without a lot of support. The other birth parent may not be involved either physically or financially in assisting parenting and caring for the child. I certainly think there's sometimes financial issues that come into play. I think we've also had, birth parents talk about how they really weren't ready to be a parent at this time in their lives. They may have aspirations to continue their education, continue their career, really tried parenting, maybe even considered adoption at the time they were pregnant, if it's an expecting parent, or when right after birth, but did choose to parent and parent for a period of time and came to the realization that maybe this is an option for them to explore, and they reach out to us for options counseling.
Do you think COVID hasn't had an effect on things in terms of just financial, where our economy is, and just birth parents and their ability to parent?
I think it has, and I think we're still seeing some of the lingering effects of that. I think some of it has gotten better. But, in any kind of an adoption situation where expecting or birth parents reach out to us, we see a vast array of reasons why they're considering adoption. And if they ultimately choose adoption, why they place their child for adoption. But I have to think that economics and financial hardship is playing a role in this. And we certainly work with birth parents who are considering placing their older child for adoption to see if there are resources available to them. Are there things that we can do to remove obstacles and barriers to them parenting their child? But many times it's a multitude of factors, that there's a number of things, and it's not just one single thing that could be, removed that would then allow them to successfully parent.
Sure. Jackie, as a birth parent social worker, when you are counseling a woman or a man who is considering placing an older child for adoption, what goes into that? What's different in those scenarios versus a newborn placement?
So I think, the majority of the options counseling is the same, right? We want to make sure that they're 100% confident in this plan, but with it being an older child, it is a longer process. So definitely prepping the birth parent, because a lot of the times they want it to move very quickly, and we understand that. But in terms of making sure that this is the best placement for the child and for the birth parents, as well as the adoptive parents, it takes a little more time to, obtain medical records for the child, any dental reports, any specialist reports, things like that, so we can share that with the family. So those are some of the differences.
Would you say the transitioning is different in terms of trying to create a plan that best serves the interest of the child, in terms of birth parent placing child into the care of the adoptive family that he or she has chosen?
Absolutely. So it's much more of a phase and a transition, like you said. So we'll usually start off with a meeting in the office or a safe, neutral location with the adoptive parents, the birth parents, and the child. It could last, maybe an hour or so. And then, we can move on to maybe a day visit, an overnight with the adoptive parents. And then we'll move on to, placement day. So there's going to be kind of multiple visits with the birth family and the adoptive family and the child to make sure that everyone's, on the same page.
And Jackie, how would you respond to folks who question, wouldn't that be more difficult to place an older child than an infant?
Yeah, I mean, I cannot imagine, and who's to say, but I think, they've been parenting that child, right? So that's another added layer of bonding, connection, and ultimately trauma that they're going to have to, work through. I would say it's harder, it's more difficult, but we're here to counsel you well before and well after.
And additionally, there can be some more stigma and shame associated with an older child placement, because there is the concept of, well, you've been parenting already for a year, 2 years, 3 years. Why can't you just make it work and quote unquote keep that child, right? Mm-hmm. So it's somewhat of a different shaming process that sometimes birth parents who are placing older children can face. And I always want to remind folks that we can connect you to other women and men who have placed older children before, so you can lean on them for support. Chris, what would you say in terms of like a statistical standpoint? What numbers are we seeing with older child placements versus newborns?
I would say it's, roughly, anywhere from 1% to 5% of the placements that we do in a given year. It is increasing slightly. I think part of what we're trying to do as an organization is let folks know, both prospective adoptive parents who might want to adopt an older child and either would be open to an infant or an older child, or may not have as much of an interest in adopting a child right after birth and infancy. And I think also letting birth parents know that this is an option, this is something that they can consider. And I think just having them have that conversation and have that discussion around what the options are for them, and sometimes are there ways to correct or improve the situation that they're currently in so they could continue parenting. I think open adoption plays a big part in this, though, that I think that parents of older children who are thinking about placing the child for adoption come to realize that they can still be a part of the child's life to a certain degree through openness, through visits several times a year, through getting pictures and letters and getting updates on how the child is doing. And certainly when a child's at the point where they're verbal and they're talking, not that there's not a bond and a connection prior to that time, but certainly once they've developed language and they're talking, part of what Jackie was talking about, that's why the transition process does generally take a little bit longer, because they developmentally where they are and based how old they are, we really want to have a sense of that they understand what's happening, but having still that connection to their birth family through open adoption, I think really helps to ease that transition, both at the time of pre-placement, placement, and then certainly for the rest of their lives.
Chris, can you highlight a little bit of the work we do with prospective adoptive parents to prepare them for an older child placement, and what steps we have to take to make sure that they're approved to be prepared for those types?
Certainly. I mean, all prospective adoptive parents do have to go through the home study evaluation process, which really is an assessment of them as prospective parents, or certainly specific to adoption, and what the challenges and differences may be than just parenting a biological child. We attempt to provide additional trainings for our adoptive parents, some that we do here at Adoptions from the Heart, and that some that we refer out to that specialize in issues around attachment, trauma, as Jackie mentioned, at least maybe the trauma of separating from their biological parents. I think that's really important. And I think we're looking at them through a slightly different lens in terms of, do we feel that you can adequately parent an infant and a newborn? And we make our families take an infant care and child care class. I think for people that are interested in adopting an older child, we want to have a better sense of, have they experience with children, interacting with them? Do they have an understanding of developmental stages and how children behave and function at different ages as they grow older? So I think some additional training. I think we provide them a lot of additional support that as Jackie had mentioned, this transition and pre-placement process is sort of a progressive process, and it generally does take longer. We're always going to look at what's going to be in the best interest of that child and helping them ease through that transition as smoothly as we possibly can. So I think there's a lot more education, there's a lot more support that we provide to them, but they still have to meet the basic requirements of being approved as an adoptive parent through that home study process.
Jackie, Chris had kind of spoken about this a little bit earlier, the idea of a birth parent still being able to have options when it comes to openness. Can you highlight that a little bit more of what options a birth parent who's considering placing an older child would have in terms of picking family and having future contact?
Yeah, so they have the ability to pick a family, right? They still have the option to choose who they feel a connection to. Obviously, based on the medical records and the situation, we'll find a family that matches, best. But they can pick the family, and for older children, we might see more openness. It might be better to have direct text message with a birth family member, whether that be an aunt or a grandma or whoever was in that child's life before, could be really beneficial. So we might see a little bit more openness.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think especially in today's world of video chatting, there's a lot of additional options that can happen because for that biological parent, they've been with that child for, a few years in some cases. So I would agree that the level of openness is definitely higher for older child placements. Not all, but I would say there's an increase in that. And we want to make sure we're finding families that are still seeing the benefit of openness in those cases. Jackie, what would you say to that woman or man who's parenting an older child, but scared of what is this going to look like? What advice would you give them?
We're going to be there to support you. We're going to be there to hold your hand and to do, whatever we need to do to get you to a place that you feel confident in. Like Chris said, we're not pushing for adoption. We want to find what obstacles and things are getting in the way for you. And if we can help identify resources, out there in our community, that's our first step, right? But whatever the birth parents want, that's what I want. So I'm going to advocate. I'm going to do whatever I can do to help them get to that place. No judgment from our end. You get plenty of that from society, from your family members, from your friends. So we are really a safe space here to help educate you on things that you might have not known prior and just empower you, right, for you to make the best decision.
And just remembering that there's no pressure. Call a local office, meet with a social worker. They can come out to your home if you feel more comfortable there, sit down, talk through how you're feeling, what's happening. And if adoption doesn't end up being the right path for you, that's okay too. We're here to help guide you and give you the resources to make the best decision for your child. Switching gears a little bit, Chris, can you discuss a little bit about the additional services we provide for folks who are looking to adopt through the foster care system?
Certainly. So as I mentioned, those types of folks would still have to go through a home study evaluation process, but it's generally a little different, and every state is different, and sometimes within a state, the foster care system runs by county and not even necessarily as a statewide system. So depending on which state the prospective adoptive parents live, they have to look at, would I be able to, with a home study from an agency like Adoptions from the Heart, would I be able to use that home study to adopt a child who's in foster care within my state? Sometimes the answer to that is yes, sometimes it's not. So many of the families who look to do this, and specifically here in New Jersey, where if you want to adopt a child who's in the foster care system, you do have to be an approved foster or resource parents through the state of New Jersey. You do have the ability to get a home study evaluation, get additional training very specific to issues related to older children and children who have been in foster care placements, and often look then to other states. So we assist the families once they are home study approved and start that search process. And there's many nationwide websites and organizations that do present children who are legally free for adoption, who are in foster care, to help the prospective adoptive families locate those children, identify them, make inquiries. But there's been a lot of supportive services as that process goes on. But once it gets closer to a potential match, that's when we really get involved in trying to coordinate some pre-placement visits between the prospective adoptive parents and the child. They almost always travel to the state where the child's residing, spend some time with them there. We've had many cases then where the child, along either with their caseworker or their foster parents, come and visit the adoptive family, at least see the home and see the community and spend some time. These children are almost always school age. I would say most of them are even 8 and older. So then there's all the issues of their medical background, any behavioral health issues, any specialized services, and then school transfer. So it's quite an involved process, but it's been done successfully. So there are just some prospective adoptive parents, whether they're single or part of a couple, that aren't interested in adopting infants or young children and really would like to pursue adopting an older child who's school age. And that's certainly something that we can provide those services to make that happen. And then, of course, once the child's placed, we would provide, like in any adoption, those post-placement services to supervise the visit, making sure things are going well, with services in place, the child is adjusting and bonding to the adoptive family before they go to court and finalize the adoption.
And Chris, can you just clarify for our audience members what we mean by older child placements? What is like the typical age range, and what's kind of the cap of what we would do as an agency in terms of ages of placement?
Yeah, I think birth parents who reach out to us for these options and then have decided they want to place their child really has ranged between 6 months and maybe 6 years of age. We've seen a few slightly older, but most of them have fallen into that age range, and a lot of toddlers, I think, make up the majority of those placements. As I said, if prospective adoptive parents are looking to adopt an older child who's in foster care, most of those children are over the age of 8. We've seen a few younger children that have been placed, but most of those children, I would say, are between the ages of 8 and 12 years old.
And then, Jackie, can you just make sure we distinguish the difference between us versus the state? I know we've been using some verbiage like foster care, and I just want to make sure folks recognize the difference between a private adoption agency versus state, in terms of, if I'm a woman who's parenting a 3-year-old and I call your agency, is there the chance that like the state's going to come try and take away my child?
No, absolutely not. If there's any concern of child abuse or neglect or anything major, then yes, as you know, mandated reporters, we have to. But if you're coming to us for options counseling, that's not our goal. That's not our end goal. We are here to provide you confidential counseling, right? And what you say to me stays with me.
Yeah. And we're not the state. We're private.
No.
Private workers. We're not necessarily affiliated with the foster care system. So what Chris was referencing before is the ability for us to provide service for folks who want to adopt through the foster care system, which is a different entity from Adoptions from the Heart. So I always like to put that out there, because sometimes people get a little confused when they hear terminology like foster care. Is there anything either of you wanted to highlight in this discussion of older child placements? Something that you think our audience members should know about?
So I think there's just some different challenges in adopting an older child, and some things maybe prospective adoptive parents haven't thought of. I mean, the child's probably going to keep the first name that they've had, especially if they're used to it and they've used it and they know it. Not to say that maybe a 6-month-old child that couldn't be a discussion between the adoptive parents and the birth parents, but certainly an older child, I think that's something that they have to consider. And, you know, there may be just more services or more involvement they've had, whether it's medical, whether it's early intervention services, you know, it could be any number of things. So I think, as Jackie had alluded to earlier, we often do have to get more information than just maybe prenatal records or labor and delivery records that we would get in an infant adoption. So every case is going to be unique and specific, but I think that adoptive parents have to be prepared that there could be a lot more that goes into it. And then, as we mentioned, I think it's just a bit of a longer and more involved transition process to make things as easy on the child as possible.
How about for you, Jackie?
I think I would say for our birth parents considering making an adoption plan for an older child, we're here. And I know there might be stigma attached to it, right? But you're doing a selfless act and looking at all of your options to see what's best for your child. And like Amanda said, even if that's just a phone call to talk to us to gain some education, and it might not be the path you want to take, then that's great. But we're here for you no matter what.
I'll add to that, if I can, that, you know, we always talk about that there's gains and losses in adoption, and certainly for all members of the adoption triad. But I think that some of those losses may be felt even more stronger in older child placement, just because of the fact that they've been with their birth parent or parents for a period of time, a longer period of time. And I think that we do try to provide a lot more supportive services to birth parents that make an adoption plan for an older child, because we recognize that that separation and that loss is going to probably be felt more deeply than not that it doesn't happen with an infant adoption, it certainly does, but perhaps to a greater extent because of the age of the child.
Yesterday, I met with a mom who placed her 13-month-old a couple of months ago. And I was asking her how she's doing, being it's been a couple of months since placement. And she was just so happy. She was so confident in her decision, and it was tough. She had actually initially intended to place this child for adoption at the hospital at birth, and she was pressured into parenting by family members. She tried it for a year, and it just wasn't for her. She loved her child. She gave her all that she could, but she just felt that it was not the best plan moving forward. She called our agency. She matched with a family. They had a few meetings prior to placement, and everything just went so smoothly. She does have direct contact with that family. They text, they send FaceTime video calls to each other, and she is just really happy with the way her experience has gone with adoption. So it can happen. It's definitely much more difficult, in my opinion, when you see what they go through having parenting the child for some time. But to see her so confident and happy to know that her child is doing well, that's what this is all about. So, we're happy that we could take some time to help educate our community about older child placements, because we are seeing an increase in intakes related to these types of situations. Thank you to both Chris and Jackie for sharing your experience. And please feel free to call a local office and chat with a social worker to learn more about our program. Thanks so much, guys, and tune in next week.